tonight. So I've just done that. We're live and recording our webinar this evening. So like I said, this is our webinar to train people to go out and talk to voters at early voting sites about the 6 amendments that are on the ballot this year. We have been working against the amendments at Democracy NC. You see my button here. We have come out as an organization against all 6 of the constitutional amendments that are going to be on the ballot. And this truth team is part of a larger campaign of ours that we've been engaged in over a period of months that involves research, advocacy, and organizing, talking to people about the amendments. We've done several rounds of polling. And from that polling, we know several things. The first thing that we know is that not many voters are aware that there are going to be 6 constitutional amendments on their ballot, and they're especially not aware that the language of these amendments is misleading and deceptive. So we have a big job ahead of us in terms of educating voters, and that's what you're here to help with. Luckily, we also know a couple of other things. For example, we know that when people understand what these amendments are about, the more that they know about the amendments, the more likely they are to dislike them, which is one of the reasons why the work of this team and the work of generally educating and turning out voters is so important, because that is what is going to help us defeat the amendments. These amendments will pass if a slim majority of people vote in favor of them. All they need to pass is 50% plus 1 of the people who actually cast a vote on the amendments. So we also know that talking to voters works. We have been taking polls periodically over the last several months, and what we're seeing so far is that talking to voters works. Polling shows that we're making a difference with the work that we're doing with the radio ads and the television ads that are on. So now is the time, since early voting has begun, that we must keep pushing. So we are mobilizing people for the entire early voting period, which started today and goes through November 3rd. And we are prioritizing high traffic areas at early voting sites, trying to reach as many voters as possible. So if you've already signed up for a shift, you'll notice that we put you in an area, or we're asking people to cover counties where we think there'll be lots of early voting traffic. That is a strategic move on our part to try to maximally deploy minimum resources. What you're going to be doing in a nutshell is talking to people as they enter the polls to cast a ballot. You won't have much time to engage people, and we're going to talk about that some tonight, but that's your basic role, is to engage them in conversation as they're going in. So I want to pause right there and go ahead and begin interacting with you all. I've got a poll for you, a question that I'd like to get your response to. So in a second, I'm going to hit a button, and you should see a poll, a question pop up on your screen. That question is, how much do you already know about the 6 amendments on the ballot? And you have a couple of options: a lot, some, very little, or nothing at all. So go ahead and click the response that best describes your basic knowledge, or your knowledge about the amendments. And I'll give you a couple seconds to get that done. Okay, looks like we've got a good number of results in here. So it looks like I'm going to share these results with you. The majority of you feel like you know something about the amendments. We have a few people on here who feel like they know a lot about the amendments, and then a few folks who feel like they don't really know much at all. So I just wanted to get a sense of where we're at as we start. I think that'll be helpful in terms of moving forward with the webinar. We will talk about the amendments specifically tonight. And I'm going to start by doing that by giving you an overview of the basics. So here's what we know about the amendments. There are going to be 6 on the ballot. You should be able to see my screen switch back to the PowerPoint here. There should be 6 amendments. There will be 6 amendments on the ballot. Hold on, my screen share doesn't seem to be working. I'm going to try this one more time. Okay. There'll be 6 amendments on the ballot, and they're going to be near the end of the ballot. So most people are going to have to turn the ballot over or vote all the way in if they're voting on the machine to find those amendments. Each amendment has a title. Simple title is just going to say constitutional amendment and have a description that is written by the legislators. And the voters are going to be asked simply to vote for or against the amendment. We also know basically that the amendments range from very vague to confusing and lacking in important detail, and some are actually outright deceptive. Many of these amendments give politicians a blank check to write in the details about the specific changes. For example, what kind of voter ID would be required, or exactly what it means to expand victims' rights. They're saying they'll decide those things after the election. And we've already heard talk that the same legislature who put the amendments on the ballot, many of whom may be voted out, we don't know, it's an election after all, would use a lame duck session between the end of the election and Thanksgiving to come back and write in some of these details. We also know that the politicians who put these amendments on the ballot have tried some of these proposals before. So we're seeing in some cases a resurrection of things we've seen before, or attempts to do things a different way. For example, we've already seen legislative power grabs for more control over our elections and the courts. If you read the paper today, you might have seen that a state court just overturned some provisions passed by the legislature related to our Board of Ethics and Elections. For example, saying that the chair of each of the county boards or the state board of election should be from the party that has the second highest number of registered voters in the state, or Republicans, in other words. They threw that provision, among others, out. And this is not the first time that specific law has been before the courts. In a related way, they've put some stuff related to the elections board in these amendments. We've also seen legislative attempts to manipulate the judicial branch. We heard whispers or rumors, in some cases saw attempts of judicial gerrymandering, so drawing the judicial maps, gerrymandering those much in the same way that legislative maps and congressional maps have been gerrymandered. Excluding voters who disagree with their agenda. We saw a voter ID bill pass the state in 2013, along with a whole range of other voter suppression measures. Many of those measures got thrown out by the courts in 2016, but now we're seeing voter ID being resurrected on the ballot. Tax breaks to the wealthy at the expense of working families, essentially everybody else who's not wealthy. We've seen tax cuts in North Carolina over the past 7 years, and this amendment attempts to make those changes permanent. So all of these changes, if written into our Constitution, would be much, much harder to overturn than they would be if they were passed simply through the legislative process. So those are the basics of what we're dealing with in terms of the amendments. Now I want to ask you all, what is it that you already know about any of the specific amendments? What are you hearing on the television, on the radio? What have you read in the newspaper? Now's the time for you to go ahead and utilize that Q&A box and type in any specific details you want to offer about any one of the 6 amendments. Go ahead and do that. Let's see what we've got. Really want to test your knowledge here, because what we're finding is it's important for us to talk to you all about what's been going on and what you're hearing and seeing in the media. It looks like we got some responses coming in here. So Michelle says former governors of both parties oppose all 6 amendments. And that is absolutely true. I want to show you, in fact, there's more than just the former governors who oppose the amendments. These amendments have been broadly opposed. Some or all of them have been opposed by all 5 former living governors, including Republicans and Democrats, nonpartisan government watchdog groups. Interestingly enough, groups like Democracy NC and the NAACP on the left, and also Americans for Prosperity has come out against the judicial power grab amendment on the right, which is kind of surprising, but nonetheless something we should note. Also, constitutional experts and scholars have come out against these amendments, as well as all 6 former Chief Justices of the North Carolina Supreme Court, again, Republicans and Democrats. There's a growing outcry from media outlets as well. Over 30 major media outlets from across the state have editorialized against the amendments in some way. We're also getting some other comments here from you all. Somebody says the ads for Marsy's Law talk about the risk of seeing your attacker out in public. So we'll start to talk about some of the myths and misconceptions about the amendments as well. Jan says the amendment requiring photo ID doesn't define what kind of photo ID would count. That's absolutely right. Members of the judiciary oppose all the amendments. is actually they oppose some of the amendments. They haven't come out with a specific position on all 6. Whitney says legislators plan to entrench gerrymandered districts that were ruled unconstitutional, and certainly some of these changes give the legislature more power. Sheila says Marcy's law is being pushed by an outside billionaire and has no funding to pay for the extra administrative time and will probably slow down a quote-unquote speedy trial. And other people are also echoing that the Victims' Rights Amendment would clog the courts, is being pushed very hard. You've probably seen television ads on that one. And other people are commenting on the judicial amendment. Nancy's saying in the Charlotte Observer, Republicans are saying that the judicial amendment installs a merit-based selection system and wants to know how to refute this. So this is helpful to see what you all are hearing, and we are definitely going to be talking about how we address some of these concerns. Raina is helping me kind of catalog what's happening in terms of y'all's comments, and I'm actually going to go ahead at this point and take a break to bring Raina in here to introduce herself. So Raina, if you want to chime in, go ahead. You should have the air.
Hi, everyone. My name is, Raina Walters Morgan. I am the Voter Protection Project Manager for Democracy North Carolina. And you've probably been interacting with either myself or with my colleague Taylor Moss, if you've already signed up for a shift. But yes, everything that you've said is pretty much really on point in terms of the things that you've heard and the things that you've seen regarding the amendments. And so having this will give us a good idea of maybe some of the things that maybe we need to focus on more. And what we want you to know too is that, these amendments are vague. And so there is really not enough training that we could give that would give you every pro and con about the amendments, the proposed amendments on the ballot. But what we're hoping is that by giving you the information tonight and sort of giving you the broad talking points, and we do have some additional information online, that through those things you can take what are really complicated issues and be able to have a really effective 20-second conversation with a voter during early vote.
Yeah, thanks, Raina. And I think also something that we're going to be finding out is that if possible, those conversations will be longer than 20 seconds. And you've generated a lot of good questions so far in the Q&A box, in addition to some of your comments. And I definitely want to come back to those. But at the moment, Raina, if you'll stay with me, I actually want to go ahead and jump right into the role play. I want to go ahead and role play with Raina to show you one way that you can use some of the messaging that we've tested about the amendments to talk about these with voters at the polls. And I want you to pay attention carefully during this role play and see if you can hear any answers to some of the questions that you've already asked about the amendments. And after that, then we can go into some additional detail about specific amendments, kind of based on where the bulk of your questions are moving us. And Raina and I can tag team that together. So Raina's going to be a voter, and I'm going to be a truth team member out at the polls who's approaching Raina to talk to her. Good afternoon, ma'am. Are you coming to vote today?
Yes, I am.
Great. Have you heard that you're going to be asked to vote on changes to the North Carolina Constitution?
I feel like I've seen some commercials. I've heard something about some amendments, but I don't know a whole bunch about them.
You are not alone. People definitely don't know enough about these, but I have some nonpartisan information that might be helpful to you. Do you have a minute for me to share that with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So here's a card that tells you what the amendments are going to say, if you want to look over that while we're talking. Okay. But I want to share with you that I'm personally voting against all 6 of these amendments. And the main reason for that is that they're very vague and in some cases extremely deceptive. these amendments were put on the ballot very last minute, and the same politicians who want them to pass were in charge of writing the language that we're going to see when we go to vote. So voting yesterday essentially is giving some politicians a blank check to write in details of things that are very serious after the fact. It'd be like buying a car and then having a salesperson say, don't worry, I'll write the contract up after you've bought the car. Does that sound like something you want to do?
No, that actually sounds like a bad idea. But I mean, okay, so I mean, there's something on here about hunting and fishing. And I mean, hunting and fishing seems fine. I don't understand why, putting that in the Constitution is a bad thing. I like
Yeah.
more, I would like to have more rights. Like, what's the problem?
Right. No, I agree with you. When I first read all of these, I thought, wow, these sound really great. And if I didn't know more, I would be very tempted to support many of them myself, because in theory, they sound good. The problem with all of them, including hunting and fishing, is we don't know what they mean by enshrining hunting and fishing rights in the Constitution. This could very well lead to things like easing laws to hunt and fish near parks and schools. It could lead to reducing common sense gun laws. It might even be used to endanger certain kinds of wildlife that we want to protect. We just don't know. We don't have enough details. Another example that I would go ahead and point out to you is there's one on there that says an amendment for a bipartisan board of ethics and elections. I care a lot about elections, and that sounds great to me, but the problem is that one's really deceptive, because we actually already have a bipartisan board of ethics and elections. And this amendment, in fact, would make our elections more polarized, because it takes away an unaffiliated member of the board and leaves it 4-4 Democrats, Republicans, which we think will lead to gridlock around important decisions like voting access and investigations of political corruption.
Okay.
And I could go on. I don't want to keep you, but I just want you to know that overall, every single one of these amendments, even if it sounds good, you don't know the whole story. And we really shouldn't put things into our Constitution if we don't know exactly what it means for North Carolina voters. And like I said, overall, I think at the end of the day, the majority of these are a bad deal for NC families.
Okay. Well, this has been helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so think about it, and take that paper in with you. Read more on your way in, because it does have more detail than we've gone into right here. But if you want to give that back to me when you're done, I'll recycle it and use it for another voter. Or better yet, you could pass it on to someone you know who hasn't voted yet, who probably also doesn't know about the amendments. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was really great talking to you. Okay, so that was a quick role play. And now I'd sort of like to hear from you all of what you took from that. I want to sort of hear what you noticed first about the how. How did I engage Raina in that role play? What are the things that worked for me in talking to her? Go ahead and type your responses into the Q&A. And Raina's going to read them as they come in.
Michelle said that you sympathized/identified with her.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sympathy and empathy are very important.
Ellen said being understanding and empathetic to where she's coming from.
So yeah, another vote for empathy there.
Jan said you agreed as often as you could.
Yep.
Sheila, you agreed with her on several points.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, making the point that we don't know all the details.
That one's very important, because it really works with people. People are very skeptical of buying into things that they don't know the details about. So that's an important one.
Sheila said, I like you are not alone.
Yes, that's also really important, because people can tend to shut down if they feel stupid, right? Nobody wants to feel stupid. Nobody wants to feel uninformed. And the reality is that a lot of voters are not going to know these are on the ballot. So letting them know that they're not alone, and that's part of this whole problem, is going to make them feel better and have more rapport with you when you talk to them.
Liz said that she liked that you noted it was a bad deal for North Carolina families.
Mm-hmm.
You made a good analogy about buying a car and having the contract written later.
Yeah, that's another point that I want to emphasize there, having an analogy. You might have also heard me use the language of it's like giving legislators a blank check. We need to help people have imagery that they can relate to understand these amendments, because they're complicated and the language is complicated, in some cases very confusing. So we have to help people by bringing it back to very simple concepts that we can all connect with. Anything else?
Like that you asked to return or give the flyer to others. Because best way to be liked is to ask to do a favor. You said you were going to vote against and presented it from a personal perspective.
Yes, that is also really important, because while you're out there as a volunteer with Democracy North Carolina, more importantly, you're out there as a voter who has your own individual perspective on the amendments. And you're going to connect best with people when you connect with them on that one-on-one level.
You talked about just 2 of the amendments as examples.
Yeah, and that's kind of probably all you'll have time for. And my recommendation there is to kind of follow, if you can, where the voter takes you, but have a couple of examples ready in your head that are really easy for you to talk about. Because just saying to people these are bad and they're all deceptive might not land unless you bring it home with analogies and examples. Mm-hmm. Anything else, Raina?
No.
Okay. Before we move on, because I do want to talk more about the content of the amendments, I just want to go back to a couple of additional points in terms of how to talk to voters. And to do that, I'm going to share with you some tips that our organizing director wanted me to share with you. Our organizing director is Cheryl. Cheryl's done a ton of talking to voters at the polls, including voter registration and stuff like this. And her first reminder to me, which is always helpful, is keep it simple. KISS. Keep it simple, smarty. Some of us like to talk. I love to talk about these amendments, and I tend to go into a lot of detail when I talk about them, which sometimes is appreciated. But in this context, when someone's walking in to vote, you're not going to have that much time. So keep it simple. Find those talking points and those stories and metaphors that can help you connect with voters. We want to be kind and generous to all voters that we interact with, even people who say things like, well, I'm all for hunting and fishing, or I'm all for victims' rights, even if we're not, on the same page to begin with. We want to respect where people are at and meet them there. And we also want to be nice to the election workers. We may cross paths with people who are working the elections, and we don't want to be a nuisance. We are allowed to be out there with other campaigners, and we want to be respectful and make sure that we are noted as respectful. Dress for the weather. We don't know these days, October could be hot, it could be cold. Make sure that you dress comfortably and have whatever you need for as long as you're going to be out there. That's really important. Cheryl also suggests arriving early and staking out a spot for yourself. And this is a really good tip too. You want to get to the early voting site and kind of get a sense of where you're going to have the most access to people who are going into the polls. You don't want to stand somewhere where you're having to constantly chase people down or yell at people from across the parking lot. You'll see other people there handing out information, maybe even other organizations or groups handing out info on the amendments. Depending on where you are, it could feel kind of like a free-for-all. So just be strategic and smart about where you stand and how you engage people. And finally, it's okay to say, I don't know, when you are asked questions by voters about specific amendments. As Raina already said, in a 1-hour training, a 2-hour training, even a 3 or 4 hour training, we can't tell you everything you need to know to be an expert on these amendments. And one of the main reasons for that is that there just aren't a lot of details for us. And that's something that you can always default to and you should feel confident in defaulting back to the talking point of, unfortunately, there's not a lot of information for us to go on. That's one of the problems with these amendments. If they don't trust us enough to give us the details, then we shouldn't trust them with our votes. Try to memorize some simple lines like that can help you when you get stuck talking about specific amendments. Would you add anything to any of that, Raina?
I think you hit it on the head. I think you did a really good job of explaining that.
All right, great.
There is a question.
Yes.
Do we have to stay behind the partisan lines? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
And that is the 50-foot buffer. So you do have to stay behind there.
Yeah.
Will we or can we have a nix all 6 or similar sign, or is a sign off-putting? We had not intended to give you all signs. There are some signs out there. I don't know actually how many we have in the office.
Not
but
many left.
We have a lot of buttons. The button that Jen has on, we do have buttons. And so if you are going to be volunteering, hopefully we can get at least one to you.
Yeah, and the good thing about the button is that it goes wherever you go. You don't have to stand near a sign the whole time. And these pop, they stand out, especially if you wear a darker shirt like I'm wearing with a button, you'll attract attention that way. Let's go ahead and hear some more questions. I want to know at this point what specific questions you have about different amendments so that we can start going into a little bit of detail. Again, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about the amendments because it's just not possible, and it's difficult for you to have detailed conversations. But I am curious what you all are thinking about. Do you have any questions so far, Raina?
Yes. One person wants to know, to your knowledge, are there any pro-amendment groups out there? And maybe if you could talk about what they're saying, that might help.
That is a great question. We haven't seen too much pro-amendment activity. That doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means we haven't exactly seen that yet. The most I've seen are members of the Republican Party out there plugging the amendments. I haven't even really seen any ads except for Marcy's Law. Someone mentioned that in the comments earlier. The Marcy's Law folks are putting a lot of money into that campaign. And one of the reasons for that is actually one of the talking points against that amendment. Marcy's Law is a piece of model legislation that is being pushed by a California billionaire with a very personal agenda. And he has put a ton of money into pushing Marcy's Law in terms of legislation and amendments across the country. So that's what I've seen the most of, is pushing for Marcy's Law, not so much activity on the other amendments. What are some other questions?
Let's see. Do we know if any pro-amendment volunteers will be out there, and do we have a copy of their materials? Who knows? Who knows if they'll be out there?
Yeah, we kind of answered that one.
Did any Democrats vote in favor of the amendments? I don't know what the legislative history was on that, Jen. Do you know?
I don't know the vote count, but I can tell you that these were pretty partisan decisions to put the amendments on the ballot. It does take 3/5 majority in each chamber to put amendments on the ballot, but the Republican Party also has a supermajority in the House and the Senate because of gerrymandered districts. So this was not a hard thing for them to do. The governor does not get a say or a veto in terms of constitutional amendments.
Let's see. What is the controversy surrounding Marcy's Law? Just that it's too vague? ?
That's a good question. And I see a question underneath that asking if we can give some basic talking points about each of the amendments. I can do that. I can start with that one since there's a question specifically about it. So here is a broad overview of what is called the Victims' Rights Amendment, also known as Marcy's Law if you're reading the newspaper and seeing other media. Here you can see what the amendment language is going to be on the ballot. It simply says a constitutional amendment to strengthen protections for victims of crime, to establish certain absolute basic rights for victims, and to ensure enforcement of these rights. Again, upon first blush and first reading, that does not sound bad at all. Here's the thing. First of all, it's unnecessary. Care for victims is very important. I don't think anybody would dispute that, which is why victims' rights is actually already part of the state constitution and North Carolina law. If we need to just strengthen those rights at any point, it should be done through a normal legislative process because Marcy's Law, as we've seen in other states, has been ineffective at actually protecting victims. One main reason for that is it places new burdens on the court system that ends up delaying justice for everyone and costing millions of dollars to implement. We've seen that in other states. So essentially, this is a flawed idea. It's the idea, as I mentioned, of a California billionaire with a personal agenda. We do need solutions for victims in North Carolina, but those should come with a lot of input from experts and from the people most impacted. A couple other points about this one. It expands the definition of victim and adds to that list of crimes where victims would have rights, about 400 different kinds of crimes. It also expands the definition of victim to include property owners and corporations. And that makes me suspicious. It makes me skeptical and suspicious without knowing the details, again, of what exactly does that mean. I don't think we should put this amendment on in our Constitution. What if that is used to give the state more power to prosecute individuals, for example, for what the state would call property crimes or vandalism, like taking down a Confederate statue or a Confederate flag or some other form of protest that people might engage in if they disagree with the legislature. Can you tell me, Raina, if there are amendments where there are lots of other questions so I can focus on that one next?
So far, a lot of the questions are with Marcy's Law.
All right.
If y'all have other questions, definitely let us know. Otherwise, Jen, I think it's safe to just go ahead to the next one.
Okay, I'll do that. And I see a question, who is this California billionaire? I don't remember his name, Raina, do you? I have a hard time keeping it in my head.
No, I don't, but I'll Google it real quick.
Okay, thank you. We'll get back to you with an answer to that question. So I think now I'm going to move to the Board of Ethics and Elections, which I did talk about in the role play. So the language on the Constitution simply says an amendment to establish an 8-member bipartisan Board of Ethics and Elections Enforcement in the Constitution to administer ethics and elections law. Again, it says bipartisan as if we don't have a bipartisan board right now, and that's just not true. In fact, this amendment is deceptive because it actually polarizes our current bipartisan board by removing the one unaffiliated member who is now a tie-breaking vote in many cases. We would be left with an 8-member board evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, who, if they couldn't agree on legislation or policy related to voting or investigating corruption, a lot of things just wouldn't move forward. So this increases the chance of partisan gridlock, which delays important decisions like where and how we vote during early voting. I like to say this is lipstick on a pig because a prior version of this same law was rejected by the North Carolina Supreme Court a few months ago for being specifically misleading to voters and a blatant power grab. The original version of this constitutional amendment talked about a bipartisan Board of Ethics and Elections, but actually transferred all power for all boards and commissions appointments from the governor to the legislature. That was tossed out. The court said, you can't do that, and you can't have an amendment that doesn't say that that's what you're doing. So they rewrote the amendment, and this new version only deals with Board of Elections, still takes power from the governor. And like I said, a state court just threw out other related provisions of a similar law today. So this is a blatant power grab, as is the next amendment I'll talk about, which is judicial vacancies. This one, I want to point out, first of all, we had to cut off the language in this amendment. We couldn't fit it all on this slide because it's extremely long. This is the most confusing, convoluted of the amendments on the ballot. So to boil this down for y'all, what it does is takes power away from the governor and voters in terms of who our judges are and gives that to legislators. Judges are supposed to be fair and independent, but this partisanizes the process by essentially allowing legislators to appoint friendly judges that would rule in favor of things that they support. With the current leadership, we know that that would lead to more rulings in favor of corporations and special interests. For example, like the giant hog producers and energy companies that have been spilling dangerous chemicals into our water. This also moves North Carolina one step closer to ending our ability as voters to elect our judges. We've already heard legislators talking about ending judicial elections and moving to a strict appointment system. They call this merit selection, but the process itself has been poorly defined. We don't know what they mean by merit. It seems like this amendment would give a lot of power to the legislative leadership. And even if the legislature flips and somebody that you support is in charge of the legislature, there's an argument to be made that the governor's power in North Carolina should not be further weakened, especially as someone who's elected in a statewide race versus legislative races that are currently very heavily gerrymandered. Any new questions coming in that would direct me to concentrate in other places?
let's see. I'm still not sold on Marcy's Law. In today's political climate, victims have been treated very unfairly. Is the idea that it includes corporations what makes it dangerous?
Yeah. Do you want to answer that question?
So one of the things that I've had some conversations with lawyers about, specifically about Marcy's Law, is that, well, a couple of things. One, the amount to implement it has been one of the hidden unintended consequences for Marcy's Law. So it's a bill that's been pushed around several different states, and in other states they've said that the cost has been very high, and they didn't intend that, and so that's one thing. This has the potential to eliminate the distinctions between the juvenile justice system, which is usually focused on rehabilitation, and the adult criminal system. And so there's a chance that when you have Marcy's Law in place, that people who are juveniles, would essentially be treated as adults in the criminal justice system instead of trying to rehabilitate them. And also the other thing about Marcy's Law, people, I think, one of the unfair arguments about that is that, if you don't support the law, that you don't support victims' rights. And that's not true. Victims' rights are already included in North Carolina law. But the thing that you have to remember is that, defendants' rights are put into the Constitution because it's a check on the government. And when people are being, tried and they are being accused by the government, those rights are in place, not because the victim shouldn't have any rights or because the victim is not important, but because, we have seen and heard time and time again about how certain communities are treated differently under the law. And so, keep in mind that the defendant's piece of the law doesn't mean that victims don't matter. The defendants are in there and they have those constitutional protections as a check against the government. And so it's probably a little longer than I wanted to get into, but those are some of the more detailed nuances about why Marcy's Law is not a great idea. I see, Marcy's Law might negatively affect the accused's rights to a speedy trial. Liz said that was helpful. Thank you. No problem at all. Is it accurate to say that right now the governor sends judicial nominations to the legislature and Amendment 5 would reverse this?
Well, so actually right now what happens is that we elect judges as voters in North Carolina. The only time judges are appointed in North Carolina is when there's a vacancy between elections, and that's the governor's job right now. And at the very next opportunity, when a governor makes an appointment, the very next election, voters get to vote whether to retain that judge or put a new judge in office. So we actually have a good bit of power as voters right now. This amendment does change that process. It takes that power from the governor in the sense that there's this convoluted process by which the legislature would send the governor a couple of options that they vet, that they hand select, that they choose. And that's why we think that this is dangerous.
Michelle says, well, what if people say, well, U.S. judges are appointed, why shouldn't the state? I think Jen may have answered your question. That is just how North Carolina does things. Judges are generally elected here. So,
well, and I would say
amendment wouldn't change that. You see what I'm saying? It would only deal with vacancies, deal with the appointments if there's a vacancy.
Right. But it might move us closer to losing the right to elect our judges. And I think that's something that we don't want to give up at this point. I mean, this is my personal opinion now, but I'm someone who believes in criminal justice reform. And for that reason, I'm against Marcy's Law and this judicial amendment, because we have a broken criminal justice system right now where innocent people are convicted or forced to take plea deals, where people are held in jail just because they can't afford to pay bail and they're there for nonviolent crimes, where women who are survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, victims, the quote unquote victims that we want to support, are treated very badly when they become a quote unquote criminal because they've actually fought back against an abuser. And that's one of my concerns with Marcy's Law, to go back to that point really quickly, is this is so ill-defined and we do not know enough about what they mean by protecting victims' rights. Now let's think about a woman who's been in an abusive relationship. This is the person that Marcy's Law is sort of pushing forward to tell people to support this. If a woman fights back and is arrested for fighting back against her perpetrator, this would give that person victims' rights. They would be the victim in this case, and they could request to be present at every single hearing that that woman is going through in the court system. We don't know if that's what they're going to do, but it's definitely a possibility based on how this is written. So what we're saying about this one and all of these amendments is it's too vague. They're saying, trust us, we'll fill in the details later. We know you want to support victims. We want to support victims. Just trust us. Let's vote for it. We don't know what that's going to mean. And we're in a polarized political climate where tough on crime rhetoric is coming back in a way that we haven't seen in a while. And I think that is going to lead to more injustice in the justice system.
Someone wants to know, why is the hunting and fishing issue one of their proposed amendments?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a definitive answer for why hunting and fishing is on the ballot this year. People who follow partisan politics much more closely than I do say that it's red meat, that is there for to draw out the conservative base because they're afraid that voter turnout is going to be low. That amendment again says just a constitutional amendment protecting the right of the people to hunt, fish, and harvest wildlife. This is another unnecessary amendment. This is already a right in North Carolina, and there hasn't been any sort of movement questioning that. And again, I'll just mention this could have unintended consequences because we don't know what they're thinking in terms of details, but it could open up the door to challenges to private property rights, to fish and wildlife protection, and to things like common sense gun laws.
And someone noted, and it's the first one on the ballot.
Yep, it's listed first. And I think the hope there is to get the momentum going for people who want these things to pass. If you vote for one, you'll go down voting for all of them. And that's one of the main reasons that we took a position of voting against all six. We don't have any organizational position on hunting and fishing rights, but we are skeptical of a government that puts amendments on the ballot very last minute with no public debate, with no details, and says, trust us, you should vote for these. We don't think that that's true.
Someone says if gun people see that one, which is first on the ballot, they would be more likely to vote for all of them. That is a speculation. If these amendments pass, how can they be changed, if at all?
They would have to be changed with another amendment to the Constitution, and that's extremely difficult to do. And that is one reason that it's urgent for us to urge people to vote against these amendments now, before we have to go back and undo something later on that will be really difficult. Before we take any other questions, I do just want to quickly go over the voter ID restriction. Now, this one unfortunately has a lot of popular support because it feels like common sense to people to say we should require voters to show some sort of photo identification before voting in person. You'll hear the supporters of this amendment say erroneously over and over again, 33 states have some form of photo ID. That's not true, first of all. 33 states have some type of ID requirement, not necessarily photo. And that's one of the problems with this. In North Carolina, this amendment is extreme. Only one state in the whole country actually has a strict voter ID amendment in its constitution, and that state is Mississippi. Mississippi, the state with perhaps the worst voting rights record in the country and the history of the country. So this also brings back a discriminatory law that we've already had in North Carolina that was rejected by the courts. So again, it's extreme. Just like the other amendments, this one gives legislators a blank check to decide what ID is acceptable after the fact. Right now, there's no plan to include military ID as acceptable ID. There's no plan to include student ID as acceptable ID. More than 200,000 North Carolina voters, 1 in 20 voters, lack a state-issued photo ID. And this includes many veterans and elderly voters. We know for a fact that our last voter ID law specifically excluded student ID, and that the legislature, in passing the law, requested data on demographics and what types of ID people were more or least likely to have, and that they chose a list of 5 types of identification that they knew based on the data that they requested that Black voters and young people were least likely to have. So that is why the court struck it down as surgically discriminatory with surgical precision, because they went after the voters they don't like and passed an ID law that targeted those voters. We shouldn't trust them to do it any differently this time. This would create a permanent voting restriction that also costs us tens of millions of dollars to implement and doesn't do anything to solve our more pressing election problems, like election security, like the need for more poll workers, the need for better voting machines, the need for better training for poll workers. We have a long history at Democracy North Carolina of fighting for fair, free, and secure elections. Photo ID only addresses one kind of problem, and that is voter impersonation, where one voter is pretending to be another voter. For one, that doesn't happen. Out of 5.6 million ballots cast in 2016, there was one case of voter impersonation, and the person was caught with the laws that we already have in place. There's no voter ID bill, no photo identification bill that will not mean some eligible voters will be disenfranchised. We know that at least 1,400 people were disenfranchised in the brief time that we had photo ID in 2016. 1,400 people. How many eligible voters is it worth disenfranchising to potentially prevent one case of voter fraud? All right, any other burning questions about these amendments? I want to kind of hear, if there are no other questions, what's resonating with you in terms of what I've been saying, what we've been saying, Raina and I, in terms of talking points. What feels like something you can remember? What feels like something that you'll be able to say to voters when you're out? Go ahead and start typing those responses.
What is number 3 on the ballot?
Is that a question about the order?
Yes, I believe it is a question about the order.
Okay, so the order of the amendments on the ballot is hunting and fishing is first, victims' rights is second, and I believe the tax one is third.
Can you comment on the income tax amendment? It hurts a lot of people.
Yes, I can comment on that one as well. So the first thing I want to point out about this one is that it's another deceptive amendment. I say that because it says, let me pull up my screen here again, a constitutional amendment to reduce the income tax rate in North Carolina to a maximum allowable rate of 7%. So it says reduce the income tax. That's deceptive because it doesn't actually do that. The income tax rate right now is 5.2%. It's a flat rate that everybody pays. So this does not reduce the income tax rate. What it does is cap how much the income tax rate can be raised in North Carolina. And the effect of something like that, when the state needs to raise revenue, which it inevitably will, this prevents the legislature from doing that through income taxes, which shifts the burden of taxes from the wealthy to everybody else. Because when we need to raise revenue, if it doesn't come from income taxes or corporate taxes, it comes from things like sales taxes and property taxes. Paying those puts a bigger burden on working family. So basically anybody who's not wealthy. So lawmakers will have to raise those other taxes to fill the gap, which is going to force cuts. They're going to then say, oh, well, we can't raise the money, so we got to cut. And it's going to force deeper cuts than we've already had, and they've been pretty bad, to things like public schools and things like natural disaster relief. So as our state grows, our revenue won't be able to keep up if we have this in our Constitution.
Let's see, will I be able to listen to this again? It's a lot to digest. Yes, we'll put a webinar up. We'll put a replay of the webinar up so you can see that. How many Truth Team volunteers at each polling place? That's really going to depend. We are hoping to get 2 people, but really, for our target locations, we'll be happy with 1. And even for the places that we are not specifically targeting, if you are interested in going out and sharing the message, we would appreciate it. Early vote is for a very long time this year. It's, about 18 days. And so, we only have but so many resources to cover every day. So we focused on the first day and the weekends, but there are a lot of days in between. So we would love to have as much help as we can get on that. The vagueness and uncertainty is the overwhelming point. It applies to all 6 and is an easy win. As you said, would you sign a contract if someone promised to fill in the details later?
Yeah.
That's a great point, Scott.
Yeah, I really appreciate you raising that, Scott, and I totally feel your pain, whoever it was that said, this is too much to digest. It absolutely is, and as we said before, and I want to reiterate again, you won't be able to have in-depth, detailed conversations with most voters about these amendments. So coming back to those top-line points and using the fact that it's so confusing and so vague as your main point is really important. We should not be voting for things that it's so hard to comprehend and understand. It should be clear, and the public should have plenty of time to debate, understand, comment on, and digest this stuff before we're asked to vote on it. We've gotten some questions about materials and stuff, Raina, so let's go ahead, because we don't have that much time left, and go through the resources that we have for Truth Team members. Are you still okay to do that?
Yes, absolutely. So if you go on this website, you can see the link in the toolbar of the screen that Jen is sharing with everyone. This is the hub for the Truth Team. It has information on there. It has information on how to sign up for a shift. Sharita, I see your comment. If you would, I guess, send me a private message if you know how to do that, and I'll double check to see where you're supposed to go. And so basically, scroll down. We want you to volunteer in a key location. These are the locations that are our targeted locations, but no, we want you to be where you can go. And if you can get someplace and it's not on this list, we still want you to go. So I will tell you, we have a specific need for people in Wilson County, Robeson County, and Pitt County. If you know anyone who is in one of those counties, we really do need help there. We didn't have anyone there today, and right now we don't have anyone there on the upcoming weekends. And so we need to get the word out everywhere. So so you can go on this page, you can sign up for a shift. My email address is on there. Actually, Sharita, if you would, that would be the easiest thing, if you would email me or call me. Email is probably a little bit better. My email is raina@democracync.org. And if you are interested in signing up for a shift, then we will make sure that you get a shift. We will try our best to get materials to you, but if you want to print some on your own, there is the ability to do that on this website as well. And so right now what we're doing is, we are trying to coordinate to get materials out there. For those of you who are convenient to the Durham office, you can come into the Durham office to get materials and to get the buttons. I know someone asked about the buttons earlier. If you are near one of our targeted locations, then we do have organizers across the state who do have some of these materials for you to distribute as well.
So if you don't have time to locate an organizer or can't come to the Durham office, there's number 4 here on this page is where you can download and print the slate card. This image on this side of the website here is what that slate card looks like. It's got the amendment language on one side and why it's bad on the flip side. So we're asking people to look at the flip side of the proposed constitutional amendments. Another way to say that is read the fine print, right? Look at the flip side, read the fine print, don't sign a blank check. If you spend time on this website, which I highly recommend, You can see tips about how to approach voters. We give you a sample one-liner for introducing yourself and talking with them. You'll also find the last webinar that we recorded on the website. You can take a look at that one, see if there were any different insights. And we will also post the recording of this webinar on this page as soon as it's available, which is usually about 24 hours after we do the webinar. So this is your resource. It's DemNC, the democracync.org/truth team. There's the URL again. There's also a short link, demnc.co/truth team. We just have a couple minutes left. I wanted to also show you this website, which is the campaign website called bythepeoplenc.com. This is another site that has amendment-based information on it that I would recommend browsing through when you have time. It shows you a video of some of the town halls we've been doing across the state. It's got ways to take action and donate that you can share with other people. And under the Learn More section, you can click on that and see some of the language and talking points about each of the amendments, which were in the PowerPoint slides that we used tonight. Somebody asked if we're going to share those. And I'm not, simply because the same language is here on this website and available to you that way. You can also see the articles we've collected of media outlets editorializing against the amendments. That's a nice quick reference point. You can click on any one of those and read through. I have personally found it very helpful to browse media and read media about these amendments because it solidifies some of these talking points in my head and gives me a sense of how other people are talking about these across the state. So I highly recommend checking that out. If you go to the ballot here on this website, it'll show you how the amendments are listed, and you can also download that as an additional resource. The last thing that I want to share with you all, and then we'll see if there are any final questions, is that as you're out there talking to voters about the amendments, you may come across people who are having some other type of problem while they're voting. And as you know, Democracy NC runs an election protection program every year. We have our hotline up and running for early voting. Raina's actually in charge of that and has been here all dang day answering phone calls, and I'm so grateful for her participation in this webinar. But I'm putting up on the screen now that voter hotline number and hoping you'll jot that down and take that with you. It's also on many of our resources to hand out to people as they might be having trouble at the polls. It's 888-OUR-VOTE or 888-687-8683. And I'll leave that up there momentarily while we see if there are any last questions.
A lot of these are logistical questions. Ellen, is there a way to know which shift you need people to sign up for? You should message me directly on that. We are keeping track of that. So message me directly. My email address was on there, is on the Truth Team page. The hours for the Durham office, I think technically 5 o'clock, but I will be here past that tomorrow. Or someone will be here past that tomorrow. But generally 9 to 5. The address of the Durham office is 1821 Green Street.
That's correct.
Okay. And numbers, is there a phone number we can call to get answers while we are at the polling place? Taylor is probably going to be your point of contact. She's been messaging and reaching out to people who've had issues or who have had questions. And her extension is 7919. So 919-908-7919.
I'm gonna put some of this information up on the screen here so that you all can see that. I'm quickly typing it in, and I can leave that up there for a second. So I've got Raina's email address on here. I've got the hotline number once again, and I've got Taylor's office line number for you to go ahead and jot those down.
This is not about the specific talking points or amendments, but I am not clear about the materials we can use and distribute to voters. When it's time, could you go over them and show us how to use them on the screen? I think maybe you got to that, Jen.
Yeah.
Go to the Truth Team website. Type in the Truth Team website one more time. That might be helpful.
All right. I'll navigate back to the Truth Team website. Just to reiterate, this is the key resource where you can find all the information. It's just democracync.org/truth team. That will bring you here to this landing page. Then you can see this is the resource that we're asking you to hand out. We're calling it a slate card because it recommends that people vote against all of the amendments. And you can get to that by going to number 4 and clicking on the link. It will open a PDF of that document. And this is also what we have available here in our office in Durham and in our remote offices in the 5 counties where we have organizers. And many of you have already gotten these materials. And if you haven't, again, the person to reach out to about that is Taylor, correct?
Yes.
So let me go ahead and put Taylor's info back up here one more time. And then I think we're about ready to wrap up.
It's 1821 Green Street.
Oh, I can type that in here too. 1821 Green Street.
At a minimum, I like to get a button. How do I do that? Liz, I'm not sure where you are, but if you're convenient to Durham, the easiest thing to do would be to come by and get it. And our organizers have buttons around the state too, so that might help. How many of the material should we print? My initial response is as many as your printer would allow, but if you would like, if you're going to do multiple shifts, let me know and we'll get some packets to you. Either we'll get them to you, or if you're convenient to one of our offices or an organizer, they've got them there ready for people to pick up. So just let us know that and we can go from there.
Yep. And I just typed in for somebody in Charlotte who the Charlotte organizer contact is. I want to say one last thing before we leave, and this should help with all of you who are wondering if you have an organizer in your area, if you're not in the Durham area. And you can find that information of our organizers and their names and contact info on Democracy NC's website as well. So if you navigate from that Truth Team site that we showed you earlier, you should just be able to open up our About Us page on democracync.org and find the info for our organizers. And I will try to quickly navigate to that here and leave that up as we close out. So as I do that, I just want to say thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to have you on, and we're so appreciative of your willingness to volunteer, to have these conversations. As I said, we know this is working, so it's vital and important, and we couldn't do it without you. So here, just as we leave About Us, if you go to staff, you can see a staff list of all DIM&C staff members, including our organizers, who the title will say here and has their contact information. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good evening.